You ready?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so week 11, 3 disciples this week, mainly because we don't know much about them, aside from their name. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Kind of keep with the theme of, showing where the Gospels lined up while asking, what about this chapter stood out for y'all?
I like that James's mother, Mary, apparently had more interesting stories about her in the Bible than the Apostle James did.
I thought there was precious little factual information. I felt like the author was stretching on this chapter more than he has in the others, which is saying a lot for me. I think he's been stretching. But yeah, you're right, Jim. I found it interesting that Mom she had a whole lot more credits. And, when I saw who his father was, I was trying to root through the Matthew and see. And I knew I wasn't crazy. His dad, they had the same dad's name, but that could be like Steve Erickson, who there apparently are multiples of. But anyway, so that, I wondered if maybe they were brothers, but he hasn't tied that in for sure yet either. But yeah, I thought there was truly, truly very little information on the three. He even kind of veered off and started talking about Peter again, and then came back, and, when we got to Simon, he pulled it back to Peter. I'm like, wait a minute, you're the one, what? So, yeah.
Yep.
I thought the information about the Zealots was interesting, and how kind of they're like terrorists, basically. I thought it was an interesting little piece in there. Because I think, what was it? What's his name? The second one. He was a Zealot. Simon the Zealot. I think his name. Because wasn't there somebody else who was considered a Zealot too?
Judas was too, I thought.
Yeah.
Judas.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting little thing about who the Zealots were and what they did. So that made it interesting, even though he knew absolutely basically nothing about Simon the Zealot himself. He just knew what they did kind of broadly.
I liked how when it talked about or when describing himself as the true manna from heaven, it's like he had such a huge crowd following him, and he people and everything, and then started going into that, and how that was so overwhelming to so many people that's when so many of the disciples dropped off and just they couldn't roll with it. It just was much for him.
I think it was also neat that they explained where all of them ended up acting as missionaries. Like James went to Syria and Persia, and Simon went to up north into the British Isles, and Judas went over to Turkey, where he even healed the king. And apparently they had documented records at one time, but were lost, that he had healed the king.
And on that note, it's interesting to think of all of them went in different directions, and who decided the directions they were going to go? I mean, isn't that strange that? And they went in so many different directions.
I found it interesting that the author could say so much good with so little material. What struck me was, as we march down this path of apostles, we have less and less information, so they become more and more ordinary, common. It's cited here, the legacy on page 168, the legacy of their true greatness is the church, a living, breathing organism which they helped found. And The Gospels are a record of how Jesus trained them. It serves to remind us that the Lord loves to use weak and common people. Mm-hmm. And it's all about the people, to me, that he brought together. And that phrase struck me, that this is what Jesus did. He trained these people. I never really looked at his time on earth in those words like that before. And clear down to the individual common apostle, they carried the word and the good news of the church to the world. Mm-hmm. And they didn't do it always with a big crowd. And I'm learning today that, the church is us. It's not the building. I'm learning today that ministry and evangelism is so often one-on-one. Mm-hmm. And we may not always or ever see the results. That doesn't diminish the task.
Very true. Very, very true. Does anyone else have a thought?
I was just going to say, we've talked about there's really very little material on these three, and yet I learned things from this chapter that I didn't know. So I'm not sure what that says about my knowledge, or if it's just the way he puts it in. But one of the things that I found really interesting is on 171 when he was talking about James, the half brother of Jesus, which they made a real notation that he was not called as an apostle. He was a leader in the Jerusalem church, so I assume he was a follower of Jesus. He's also the one who penned the New Testament epistle. I guess I'm not sure that I even realized that. I put those two things together, that I just somewhere didn't think, oh, that's James the disciple. I also thought it was really interesting before he started talking about the individuals when they talked about and somebody mentioned this just a little while ago, when Jesus started talking about started using things like, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. And basically, many of his followers walked away at that point because they didn't understand what he was saying, but none of the apostles did. They stayed there. They either didn't understand, but they didn't understand, but they believed in him enough to stay and to get the rest of the story, I guess.
Well, and that's where we get the gospel acclamation of, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life.
And also, go ahead. Go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say the thing that I found really interesting, that kind of stuck out to me, and it's kind of a little spot, but you guys already mentioned that James, because we knew so little, but his mother got more attention than he did in the Bible. But it also reminds me again of, Peter's wife went with him. Jesus's mother was there. Jesus's brother was there. James's mother was there. We're getting all these mothers. We're getting all these brothers. We're getting all these. It's a family affair. And out of these 12, like growing up, we've said it before, always thinking it's just these 12 there, but it's their family members, it's their spouses, it's their best friends, it's all of those small connections that make a larger thing, that once again struck kind of home. And going back onto James, the brother of Jesus, I remember growing up, that there was a debate at one point of that Jesus didn't have brothers, and it was a huge debate going on, and it's right there in the Bible, and nobody ever just went, wait, it's right here. Like, we know it's right here, and it just shows the lack of me at that point in my life, and still to this day struggle of truly understanding the entirety of the Bible and how that's a necessary factor that every step of my life, going back to the Word and learning and questioning, and that's a big important part.
Yeah. There's always something to learn, and I'll just be honest, there's some things you do forget, even as you're going through Bible studies, and you need to relearn again. The other piece that I just wanted to highlight that no one has mentioned yet was Judas, the son of James, how he had many names. And I thought that was really good, and I was glad that they really did share some of that, especially when they started talking about, I'll say, the nicknames of him being more of a mama's boy or kind of I'll say a heart child, just to kind of give some of the descriptors that kind of give him more character, give him more life or an understanding, because we don't know much about him. I've heard from other scholars there too where we don't have much about these men because they weren't necessarily the front men, they were the doers. They were the ones who were going out, doing some of the labor, doing some of the work to make the connections that others could come and be a part of the crowds that Jesus was speaking to, or even some of the other disciples were preaching to. They weren't necessarily eloquent speakers all the time. Sometimes they may have followed the example of just that one-on-one, how can we care for each other a little bit more.
Any other last thoughts? Not seeing any. Eric, go ahead and jump in.
I have one. I have one.
Yes, ma'am.
So, piggybacking on what Pastor just said, when James says to Jesus, "Why are you going to disclose yourself to us and not the whole world?" When I read that, it was kind of like a light bulb moment, because it made me think that these 12 or 11 were the world. They were the world that he was grooming to go out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah. As we've said, back then it was tradition to have a handful of disciples or a handful of people that you really kind of taught, and Jesus following that tradition also kind of shows you have to do that. We've talked about education, how many kids is too many in a classroom. We still debate it today. You could have a college class that's got 300 students, but then you have the TA who's in charge of the small group. It's not surprising. You learn better in those intimate, smaller settings where you can discuss and can debate. And I can't imagine what it would have been like had Jesus not pulled these disciples aside. Go ahead, Eric. All right. The 3 disciples, as we said, not much on them, but pulled quite a bit. I did find it interesting that we're not really sure if he's Matthew's brother, Jesus' cousin. Is he related to one of them? And then if so, it kind of proves that, there were now, 2 different sets of brothers. This would be the third. So half of them were brothers or siblings. Or he was, related to Jesus, which I don't know about you, but I would have a hard time believing one of my siblings was, the Messiah, or one of my cousins. It just, that kind of faith to convert, his mother, maybe a cousin, We know, James' stepbrother, the other James, kind of mentioned. So it really, to me, it lends to the fact that you look at somebody and say, dude, I saw you when you were a little kid and scraped your knee. And now I can see that you are the Son of Man, the Messiah promised, the one who's here. My question for you all about James the Less is, we kind of mentioned before that we sometimes feel like we like to be behind the scenes, that we're not really the Simon who gets up. This is the true behind the scenes guy. He is lost to obscurity. Do any of y'all feel like you relate to him, or do you think that from your own personality you do like a little bit of that recognition? Or does every group kind of need a James the Less?
I think any kind of group like this, and I'm sorry I could have mentioned this thought earlier, but I was kind of trying to break down this chapter into 3 people to maybe 3 separate talks. But, the more I'm learning about the personalities and the strengths and weaknesses of the 12, any group you have, there is going to be more vocal, more boisterous, more in-front personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily that they're leaders, not necessarily that they do anything better. It's just a personality trait. And I think for the most part, in my opinion, in any group, you have far more people that have the strength to make things happen that just don't stand out. They just do.
Mm-hmm.
They stand back, they see what's happening, they see what Peter is saying, and they go do something rather than standing up and say, hey, I like that, I'm going to go do it. They just go do it. And sometimes they go do it without even being talked to, or the idea coming to them from outside.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things I really like about the way I perceive Jesus picking all these people, is because there's some personalities, but for the most part, we go back to the no-name, the no-nonsense, the unknown, the plain, the ordinary, and yet they were the people that went and did everything. And I'll bring that back to today, and I'm trying to tie this into how I can be a better emissary of Christ. And I need a group for support and for learning, but I don't need a group to go out to evangelize.
Mm-hmm.
That's my big takeaway so far, which is a real big leap for me, because that's putting me out there alone. And that's not a place I normally go. But I'm really coming to an understanding of what Jesus was trying to do, I think. And maybe that's obvious to you guys, but it's really pretty eye-opening to me right now.
I would say, Kimball, we're all in the same boat. And even if we had the notion of that, we forget it on a daily practice. And that's one of the things that I think, like you said, having these groups is so powerful. And when you were talking about, the group dynamics and stuff like that, I immediately went to a sports analogy, like a football. You have your quarterbacks, your receivers, your running backs, and these are the big namers, but nobody talks about the line. But if you don't have a strong line, you can't move that ball.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the unsung heroes of the sports game. And especially these 3 are the unsung heroes of their church. And then the disciples below them that they could, helped and guided and all that as well. So.
I was looking back in the chapter, Do we don't even know where, do we have any idea where James went to witness? I mean, or is that just, again, not anywhere in the Bible or the history of the church or anything where he, because I couldn't find it, and as I look back, I didn't find it either. I just wondered, maybe the pastor would know that, or anyone else would know.
Tradition had Syria and Persia.
Gotcha.
So he's one that's kind of lost a little bit because we know he goes out into the Gentiles, but we don't know exactly where he goes or how far he goes. There's some talks where he joined others in going into India, but then he really didn't, I'll say, preach a whole lot. He was more of the support guy. And then there's other parts too where he is known for being in this area and really making a difference. This is kind of, he's honest when he says we don't have a lot on these three, because we have maybe a few lines at max of each of these men.
Jim, when Jim said that, that made me look back. There, it does say in here that there are some accounts that they went to Syria and Persia, that James did, and that he may have been stoned. I somehow missed that in my first reading. So, or maybe others say he was beaten to death. So, or crucified like Christ. Just don't know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's. It depends on who you're reading, or are they getting confused with someone else? Because, again, these are lesser known people that there wasn't a whole lot of documentation on their lives. And I think in some regards, that's kind of the way they wanted it. They didn't want to be elevated themselves. They wanted to be pointing everyone to someone who was sitting much higher than they were. They wanted everyone to know about Christ. I think, as Kimball was saying, that sometimes that's our hardest calling, is to not necessarily find others to go with, but simply go out on our own. One of the professors that I had in seminary said, you're supposed to be like John the Baptist. You're supposed to be pointing everyone out and saying, there he is, there's the Lamb of God. And that's your job. Anything more, that's extra.
You know, I was thinking that if I was a member of a church that had a long tradition, and it was over in Persia, and it had been had a tradition that it had been started by James, that might be a piece of knowledge that had been carried down through the generations, so that it might have been there might have been sources of information that were other than just the Bible about what some of the apostles did after Jesus died.
But then it's a question of which James, now that we know that was a common name. And then, it just, because of what happened immediately following of the persecution, and then the knowledge that this is a turbulent area of the world. There's been wars, there's been invasions, and every single time someone comes in, they tend to destroy either the churches in the place or whichever religion they're just replacing. So a lot of it got destroyed over time. And don't forget that going back to the original, to the disciples, they were absolutely certain Christ would come back in their lifetime. Up until towards the end, and they went, oh wait, we need to write this down.
And I think also going into that, Scott, the whole concept of if it was written, they were being persecuted. They didn't want any documentation of where they were or how, what their practices were or anything like that, because that could be used against them as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to what you said there too. This is a highly volatile area where there is going to be a lot of dissension, and Christians at that time were not the majority by any means. They were a small minority, and they would have been ostracized, cast out. or even very much looked down upon because they weren't worshiping like everyone else was. And a lot of their records would have either been destroyed. And keep in mind, too, we're talking about an area where other religions would have continually been against one another. I'm thinking as the Muslim faith came around, I'm thinking of they had other like Zoroastrianisms or other religions that had just been a part of that empire and that region that were vying for converts, vying for a voice, and trying to keep everyone else quiet.
Well, that doesn't include the Roman Empire by itself that had, I don't even know how many gods and goddesses.
Yeah.
The Greek Parthenon. You know there's a ton of them. You don't really know who they all are, and they added them just as, they conquered new areas. So, any other thoughts on James?
You kind of already mentioned it, but the way he describes, and this is something that I want to go back and look at, is it sounds more promising that he was a cousin because of the two accounts at the cross than it does that he was the brother of Matthew. Or if it's both, then that means Matthew is also a cousin. And that is kind of mind-blowing as well. And so just mentioning that again and going really hearing those two stories back to back like that of him on the cross, you can really see why we think that, or it could be.
I actually need to go look that up again.
I put a big pink question mark with my highlighter on that whole paragraph. See?
Yeah.
I just think it's fascinating when you read that and going is he? I don't know, but the possibility is so cool to know, and that's why I like it and going I have no clue, but it doesn't technically matter, but how awesome is it how close they are with their families and stuff like that if that's the case. And so I like kind of knowing those little things. So
I think it would be go ahead.
No. I was going to ask if you had something because I saw you unmuted.
I think that would be cool, Eric. I hadn't thought of that connection. In my head, if Matthew were even a distant cousin of Jesus, that makes his it's not really conversion, that's not the right word in this particular instance, but that makes Jesus calling him even more astounding because he was he would have been more than the black sheep of the family. Mm-hmm. In my head, it could explain how Matthew would have had such a big turnaround because his own family wouldn't have talked to him, and to realize who it was that did is kind of a chilling thing for me to think about, because I think that in my head that explains a whole lot. That could explain a whole lot.
Well, and also remember, John the Baptist was related to Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it means God really focused in on that line. We know he did, but now it even ties in deeper.
Well, I actually, you kind of blew my mind there for a second because I hadn't even put in the connection of that Matthew. We know that he had a lot of knowledge of the scriptures, but we the other night had the question of how did he do it?
How did he do it?
What if his brother was the full information? And we don't know, but that his brother didn't write him off, even though his family did. I don't know. I mean, that's something that I hadn't thought about before.
Put it on your list of questions when you get there. And then I think, for me, one of the explanations why we don't know a lot about some of the characters in the Bible, some of the players in some of these stories, is I'm not sure that the apostles could ever have imagined that somebody would be reading a letter that they wrote 2,000 years after they read it. Our family just gets kind of puzzled when we read letters from my grandmother. Yet when we gave it, my cousin gave it to our oldest cousin, she was like, it was like I was sitting right next to her. I can read the letter and I have no connection. I don't know who those people are because I was the youngest. I was the baby of the family, so I get that nickname. But that probably would have been unfathomable. Well, of course you know who Scott is. Everybody knows who Scott is. Well, no, 1,000 years from now, nobody's going to know who Scott is, and they may not have figured out that Scott and Eric were brothers. Or wasn't that coincidental? They happened to have been brothers. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. We don't know, because they both had a mother named Cindy, but Cindy was kind of a common name, so we really don't know. I mean, if you kind of put it in that context, it makes a lot of sense. A, it wasn't the important part of the story, which is why they probably didn't write it down. But B, I feel like, well, everybody knew who James was, for pity's sake. We knew who that James was, so.
So going off of the combo about Matthew, and knowing, if he was the black sheep, let's talk about Simon the Zealot. The fact that, as y'all mentioned, terrorists. I mean, these are the guys who were walking around with these little carved daggers, and I've seen one. Mm-hmm. They're small, they're designed, they're curved so that when they go in, they hurt to take out. I also found out that they are actually meant to be broken off in some cases, so that they can't be taken out easily. I mean, this was just a weapon of assassins. This man was walking around with Matthew, a tax collector, a guy that, before Jesus, he would have looked at and said, we're targeting him. Now, he would have been a little moody from what we learned, not a big, so it probably would have been like Zebedee that he would have targeted more if he could. But Matthew would have been he's on the street corner, let's go. How shocking to y'all is it if you really make that connection and go, a zealot and a tax collector were walking side by side for years?
Well, God had selected Paul as well. Because Paul had certain capabilities. Well, obviously, Simon was a real enthusiastic leader for a cause, and Jesus probably figured that he'd be able to change causes and be just as enthusiastic about it.
And Rome was the occupier at the time. They took over, and so they were trying to get them out because they're not very nice. They were not a bunch of nice rulers. They were putting them up on crosses and crucifying people for whatever they wanted to do it. They're kind of vicious and mean, so I think they were just trying to be they're just kind of sneaking around doing this stuff and trying to get their country back. But you see a lot even today where there's small groups that try to get the oppressors out. And so that kind of makes me feel like less negative towards them because they're really the cause seemed more righteous maybe or something. Even though they were probably very violent people, at least they were trying to do something in a positive way for their people, I guess, not trying to be peacemakers by any long shot. But it was just an interesting thing. I don't have, I guess, as much of a negative idea of him just because he really had a really strong cause to go for. Because Rome wasn't very nice at the time. And we all know Pontius Pilate was pretty famous for not being very nice. And so they would just go around and try to get these guys off and on, which probably not the best way to go about it, but at least they were trying to do something. I think I remember reading about the next Judas at another time. But he was kind of the same way, because they really thought Jesus was going to come as a Messiah and overthrow Rome and get them out. And that was a really strong feeling of theirs, and they just thought this was the way to do it. So, anyway.
So I really appreciated this because this is one of those groups that we don't necessarily think about or talk about. We often talk about the Pharisees or the Sadducees, who were the religious leaders in the temple. But we often don't talk about the Zealots and the Essenes. And so he actually gave them some ink on the paper, so to speak, and we actually get to learn a little bit about them. I agree with Susan. Depending on which side of the aisle you're standing on, are you in agreement with Simon the Zealot, or are you against Simon the Zealot? At the same time, too, he had a method that many didn't necessarily agree with. It was the voice of the minority. And yet when Jesus had him at the table as well, I think it also gave a description to the kingdom of God that he was trying to share to the world. I'm calling tax collectors. I'm calling the zealots. I'm calling all of these individuals, these normal people that we might look upon and say, well, they don't go together. How do they all fit around the same dining room table? And yet Jesus says, they're my followers. This is who God has called and chosen. So as we look upon this, we might say, well, how does this work? And Jesus just looked at it and says, it's going to work.
Well, any of us can find a personality among the apostles that are similar to our own, even though we may be very diverse.
I actually, hearing Susan kind of talk about it, like it took me kind of aback for a second and went, yeah, I agree with you, but at the same side, what Pastor said is like, depending on what aisle side you are on. And I like to always put myself in both sides or in those shoes and stuff like that and going, well, we've labeled tons of people terrorists. And they're doing exactly what he was doing to some extent in our own life. And you know, we're called for forgiveness. And how sometimes that first step of peace is that forgiveness factor. And I've never thought of it that way before, of looking at him as an example of him being a terrorist and in my own life, and where and how in the world I might need to relook and reassess labels or anything in that manner, and take a step back and go, hey, this could be a peaceful moment if we can find a way.
That actually reminds me. Go ahead, Mom. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, when somebody was talking about, I think Scott, you said it, I think that Matthew and Simon came together, two very, very different people with very different careers, very different paths, obviously different ideals. But to think that they came together because of their belief in Jesus and following him should give us a message that we can do that too. I mean, we can come together and work together for evangelism, for the church, for Jesus. We can do that, even if the people are different than we are.
Well, and I think it was a TED Talk where someone actually said, you know, we watch Star Wars and we root for Luke because, you know, as Americans, it's rugged individuality. It's you know, this great moment of self-triumph. But there are actually parts of the world that watch that movie and they think of America as the empire.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Reddit group called The Empire Did Nothing Wrong, and they jokingly, you know, look at the rebellion of Luke and say, you know, he was a young kid, joined a rebellion or a religious group, went up against, you know, the group, the larger, and blew something up. It's what side are you on?
Mm-hmm.
Some would look at Matthew and say he was evil. Others would look at Simon and say he's evil. In many ways, they kind of both were the extremes. And neither are really right. But put them both together at the same table with Jesus, and all of a sudden, they're evangelizing together. They're they're establishing a religion that even today we're still worshiping, and know that yes, he was the savior. This is one of the things that really does highlight that. All are called. All are welcome.
I was thinking that yesterday we had our grandkids over, and we went for a drive over to the tennis courts, and we got to talking, and I was saying that, sometimes I may break a law, a driving law, in order to avoid an accident. However, if I do get caught going through a red light because there was a guy right on my tail and he would have run into me if I slammed on the brakes when the light turned red, if I get caught, I do have to pay the price. I have to pay the ticket. And I kind of think that there are some things, like killing, that are fundamentally wrong. But you could always justify killing in certain circumstances, but we have to pay the price. We get caught at it, and they did have to pay quite a price for the actions of the Zealots.
Mm-hmm.
Charlotte, you're unmuted.
Only when I have something to say. I haven't read ahead, so I don't know how they're going to portray Judas, but I will find out. I guess I feel like, especially for those two individuals, for Simon, the one who was the zealot, and for Judas Iscariot, that maybe they connected with Jesus because of their own expectations. I mean, it makes sense to me for the zealot part, because nobody liked Jesus anyway by the time nobody in Rome liked him. I mean, he was making the Jewish leaders upset. So he kind of makes sense to connect with, right? If you're a zealot and you're trying to overthrow the government, this guy might actually do it, right? He seems to have his act together. He's healing people. He's doing some really interesting things, and maybe we can connect, and I believe we have the same goals. But one of them obviously was able to change his expectations and his heart and respond differently. He took that passion that he had and allowed Jesus to change his direction in life. I don't know what I'll say about Judas when we get there, but the same passion that drove Simon to have those kind of convictions would have played very well when he realized who Christ really was and when he took that message out. Because if he was willing to face death the first time, he certainly would have had no problem being as passionate about his mission for Christ.
Cheryl, I think you're right. There's we don't really have any writings from Simon the Zealot or any of the disciples, or at least much of, about, well, why did they join Jesus and his following? We do hear that some of them were called by name, that a great miracle was performed on their behalf, kind of. But Simon the Zealot, I think, as many Jewish people, they were longing for a Messiah. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Many of them had different expectations of the Messiah, what he would be for them as a people and as individuals. Many of them viewed the Messiah, though, as, I'll say, the judges of old in the Old Testament, where it would be a leader of the army, a leader of the people, to lead them against an enemy. And so many of them saw the oppression of Rome as the thing that was holding them back, as being God's people again. And so I think there were many people that were longing for that Messiah, looking for that Messiah, but for what reason? And looking at the screen here, I'm noticing we lost a Scott.
It looks like we did. That looks like his feet got kicked off. So we'll go on to Judas, the son of James. Any thoughts on Judas? I liked earlier how Pastor was saying that he had nicknames. I remember my nickname growing up. My brother never could call me Eric, so he called me Eggett, and it stuck with me all my life. But it kind of shows, like, especially, that small connection feel of a group of family, because they called him by a nickname, or they called him by that kind of stuff. So.
And I just want to pause this. We had someone call in, so yeah, I thought so.
I lost my internet connection on my computer. I got my Wi-Fi.
Okay.
I'm trying to reboot, but until then, hopefully I can kind of lead us here.
So it's entirely up to you if you want to lead. Otherwise, Eric or myself can kind of help you out while you get that solved.
I'm okay with that since y'all can actually see the slides still, and I know you all were talking about while I was gone.
Okay, that works.
And I can chime in as I have thoughts.
Yeah, sometimes we get to be a leader even when it's unexpected. You don't always feel prepared, and I'm sure many of the disciples felt the same way.
Well,
I'll just say this. I talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about what it is we appreciated, but Judas, the son of James here, where he had the multiple names. Again, okay.
I'm muted.
Where we had the multiple names, we really don't have a lot on Judas, but I am curious as to what others kind of gleaned, or what they liked, or what insights they learned from Judas himself.
I think that with all name changing that goes on in the Bible, why wasn't Judas given a different name? This Judas.
So this Judas, really, he. Well, are you asking why he was given so many names?
No. Christ knew that Judas of Iscariot would betray him.
Mm-hmm.
Why bring another Judas into the flock and still call him Judas? Why didn't he call him like the Rock, like Peter?
Sure. Part of the reason is your name is your name. Your name in and of itself does not always define who you are, but it is the name that others will call you by. No one at the time, except for Jesus, knew who was to betray him. But Jesus also had an understanding as to why each one of them were called, for a reason, for a purpose. We'll talk more about Judas the Iscariot next time when we talk about his chapter, but this is where I'll say the disdain or the negative idea behind just the name Judas is kind of given after the treachery or the betrayal. Judas otherwise was a name that was very common. We hear that when Jesus was actually brought before the crowd and they were calling for his crucifixion, there was another man who was there with him, and his name was Judas Barabbas. And so they would call out for Barabbas, give us Barabbas. Because Judas was actually a very common name. Think of it like today, John. It was, again, a very common name like Eric or James or, as we've talked about before, Cindy. It wasn't like Kimball. It was a name that was very common. And to have him relabel it, I think he wanted the others to realize their own role and their own importance, and he didn't give everyone a new name. Only Simon Peter was the one who really got, quote, a new name, and that was really to distinguish that he would become the rock upon which the church was built. He would become the next leader of the group.
Well, and the Catholic Church actually renamed him as Saint Jude down the road, so to kind of distinguish him away from Judas Iscariot.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time period, as Nathan said, there's no reason, or there wouldn't have been a reason, because Judas wasn't a bad name.
Right. I see Kimball, and then Cheryl has unmuted. Okay, now it's Cheryl.
You're muted. Well, I guess it's only what everybody thinks because we don't know that yet. But apparently a couple of the gospel writers chose to add extra names for Judas. And then, of course, there's John, my favorite black and white person, who says Judas, not the traitor. Like, Cheryl, not the idiot. Whatever it is. And it just, but John is just kind of one of those people. So, but the other two, I just wonder if, because he obviously wrote it after the fact, they weren't writing in their daily, maybe they were writing in their daily diary, but probably not. And I wonder if maybe Matthew chose to put those words in it instead of saying, Judas, not the bad guy, right? Because everybody would probably be, so maybe he tacked on those other names that he was known by to kind of make the connection, but poor Judas had always been called Judas, not the bad guy, from that day forward. And maybe, I just wondered if that was postulating, that maybe that's why they put those extra names in. Maybe it was like an afterthought. Because, wouldn't you just hate to have been named Judas? And if you walked in a room and said, hey, this is Judas, one of Jesus' followers. Well, if they hadn't heard what happened to the other one, they might have thought, people could have gotten confused, right? For those who didn't know, he hanged himself. But just a question in my head.
So I'll give a different association for us to kind of think about. Toilets, in and of themselves, are sometimes called Johns. And for many people who are named John, that can seem, why was I named after a toilet? I mean, when you think about it that way, you can kind of chuckle at the idea, or you can kind of, I haven't really thought about that. But with Judas, it becomes almost tradition that it is known as the betrayer. For Americans, this would be like Benedict Arnold, the one who had betrayed us to the enemy. I don't know too many Americans who are wanting to name their children Benedict anymore. English people still name their children Benedict, but Americans not so much. Kimball, I'm going to come back to you and ask you, do you have your question still, or are you...
I think I just bumped it with my knuckle.
Oh, okay. You were just stretching, huh?
My wife says that sometimes I have it on and I don't know, and my coughing is loud or my breathing, and so I try not to make her have to mind me so much. She's got enough to do.
All right, so to real quick cover the three disciple symbols. So with James the Less, as you said, nobody really knows what happened to him, but one of them says that he was killed and then dismembered with a saw. Hence his saw. With Simon, he basically was a fisherman of men with his preaching. So that's why there's the Bible with the fish. And then the only thing with Judas, or St. Jude as we know, is possibly a fisherman. He sailed, so that's where he gets his symbol from. Again, this is all based off of Catholic legend because there's not much known about them.
And just also James the Less, the other symbol is actually a club, is the other one that he's associated with.
Mm-hmm.
So he was clubbed to death and then sawed apart. Maybe. Alright, next slide, Eric. So now that we've finished all of the disciples, I just wanted to show this is what we know or theorize of their journeys. Possible legend. Quick Google search, kind of take a rabbit hole to find it because most of them show Paul's 4 journeys.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it is kind of interesting to see just how far they went. Our whole life is like, oh, they went to Rome, maybe Greece, Jerusalem definitely, and kind of stayed there. But no, Tom's India. It wasn't Joseph, it was what, Thomas, the Great Britain. So this one might be a little off. But they went everywhere in Europe and to the Far East, or towards the Far East. Unless anyone has a comment or wanting to keep looking at this. Eric, go ahead and skip the next slide. I had something prepared just in case there wasn't enough to talk about for the other 3. And hitting on what we now know about every single one of the disciples and seeing the 11. Not Iscariot, but the 11. We now kind of see what a spiritual personality that God called all of them to have and to be. And I found it kind of interesting, like Simon Peter was really bold and he had to learn restraint, while James the Lesser, if you look, he seemed kind of meek, and yet he needed to learn to be a little assertive. So there was the opposites, and they all had to learn that middle ground. I have to wonder if maybe they kind of fed off each other and learned from each other, and whether or not they might have rebuked each other a little bit, kind of like Simon Peter and Paul later on. Jesus with Simon Peter, obviously, and I kind of like to think that, yeah, they did grow from each other. They did learn. Very similar to, like, best friends. Okay, why are you talking so loud there? You need to calm. Listen, don't talk. Obviously, we'll post this out, and we've still got the last next week, the last one. But that kind of sums up really this week's conversation, unless anyone has anything else to add.
I want to add one thing. The very last sentence of chapter 9, I highlighted and underlined it because it fits in with the diagram you just showed.
Mm-hmm.
It says he, referring, of course, to the last disciple or apostle we just talked about. He says, like them, the rest of the disciples, is proof of how God uses perfectly ordinary people in remarkable ways. I think that really sums up the book. Perfectly ordinary people like us to do remarkable things.
Yeah. That leaves next week Judas Iscariot. But to end tonight, would anyone like to lead us in the Lord's Prayer? Oh, no, Jen, if you had something you wanted to add.
Well, I was just going to say that we talk about ordinary people, and we talk about the personality traits of the disciples that Jesus has chosen. But we haven't talked about the physical condition of the men that he chose. Is it possible that James the Lesser or Judas was actually had a growth problem when he was younger, so he was a smaller person? Are they physically able to compete with one another or to compete with the mission to be able to accomplish that mission that Jesus wanted them to have? So we talk about ordinary, but I don't know if we've ever explained what ordinary is.
Well, for me, it kind of goes back to what he says on the relationships that they had. If it was important, it would have been mentioned. It doesn't matter if they were, tall, broad-shouldered, short. They had a purpose, and God knew what it was, and God knew how to shape them so they could accomplish it.
Well, and I think there wasn't the medical descriptions like they would have today. They wouldn't have necessarily viewed some of the, depending on if a person did have any disabilities or anything like that, they would have probably attributed more to, would have been a curse, would have been someone sinning, and then the question really would have been, who sinned? Was it the parents? Was it generations before, or was it the child? Is typically the question that comes around. We really don't know. But if you recall in The Chosen, that's one of the reasons why the director had the different characters or the different actors. One has a disability who walks with a limp. That's why Matthew had he was on the autism spectrum. He's trying to portray to people that just like you, just like me, even with your imperfections, even with the world viewing down on you, does not mean that God would not call you to do miraculous things. I'll just reiterate, there's a lot we don't know. And there's a lot we're never going to know until we see them sitting on the thrones in heaven that God has given to them. And then we're going to be able to see. And then the next question is we're just going to probably say, oh, that's who that was? I have so many questions. That are we really going to be focused on some of those other pieces? Probably not. But great question that where do these nicknames come from? Could it have been this? Could it have been this? Possibly. I think just keep asking the questions and keep exploring and reading. That's how we all learn.
Any volunteers to end us or lead us in the Lord's Prayer?
Oh, sure. Our Father,
Who art
who art in heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.